Hello everyone, my name is Zsuzsa Millei and I'm talking from Finland. I'm the co-chair of the virtual conference of the Comparative and International Education Society in the US. In this discussion, we will have a short extension of the Agora session that we held as the opening session for the virtual conference. And I would like to introduce you Judith Mair, who now speak a little bit about herself.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. My name is, as you say, Judith Mair. I'm an associate professor in the business school at the University of Queensland, and my job there is discipline leader for the tourism, hospitality and events courses and programs. I have a particular interest in conferences and conventions, as I did my PhD on them, and I've published a little bit since then, including several academic papers and also a book. And so it's one of my particular favourite research interests.
This is wonderful. I think that we can use a lot your experience in discussing further about virtual conferences. And in the Agora session, we already outlined some of the ways in which carbon zero conferencing can become a possibility, but also there were lots of difficulties discussed. So more specifically, you are an expert on academic conferences, and we wanted to hear more about what is beneficial in academic conferences and how we could replace those benefits if they are linked to traveling with other types of meetings. Mostly thinking here about online platforms. During the Agora, there were important points raised that perhaps the idea of conference is not the best to use in developing this new type of meeting. It was argued that the concept or word of conference limits the imagination of other types of meeting possibilities. Moreover, that the conference might be not most useful way to conduct in the 21st century intellectual engages and discussions. So when we talked about this, I introduced the idea of vegetarianism when people started to shift, more and more people started to shift to vegetarianism, the idea of replacing simply meat with some other food items is not really the thinking that vegetarian cooking is all about. So I was wondering, for really enjoy vegetarian food, we really need to recreate the whole idea of cooking without meat. So it's basically cooking with vegetables. So I was wondering how to rethink the conference in a similar way, that it's not just replacing an online meeting, an on-site meeting with some online platforms, but also to rethink the idea of what this meeting could be and what are the possible ways to make it happen. So with this short introduction, I would like to ask Judith to talk a little bit more about her knowledge about conferencing.
Thank you. And that's a really lovely analogy, the vegetarian one. I guess the first thing to think about is, why is it that we meet at all face-to-face? So why do we run conferences, and what's special about running conferences face-to-face? So much of my research has been about consumer behaviour in terms of conferences, why we attend them and what we find important and where we get the benefits. So the research that I've done, along with several other people as well, has suggested that there are a range of things we're looking for when we attend a conference. And the most important ones are the opportunities to network with other people, the chance to get involved in personal or professional development and education, also the cost of a conference, which can be a barrier, the location of the conference. Often people travel because they like the idea of traveling to a particular place, the time and convenience that a conference is held at, whether there are clashes with other conferences or other events or other work requirements, and also whether people feel that their health and well-being is likely to be ensured wherever the conference is. And that's much less of an issue for conferences in major cities, but sometimes can be an issue for conferences that are taking place in rural areas, or perhaps sometimes for third world or developing countries or island nations. So we know why people want to attend conferences. And interestingly, the main one that does come up often is networking. So it's often about, why do people want to be at conferences? Well, the answer is they want to meet people. And that can be social meeting or business meeting. And so we often find that the most value that people get from attending a face-to-face conference is that face-to-face networking with people. And that can be formally, that can happen, formally during conference sessions, asking questions, but it can also happen during the informal time that you have at a conference. So maybe during the coffee breaks or over drinks at a bar or at the conference reception, for example. And that opportunity to meet new people, to talk to them about your research, to find out a little bit more, perhaps about somebody whose work you've been following for a long time, is really the key thing that comes out in research as why people feel that they want to attend conferences. There are other things as well. Learning and knowledge sharing are very positive outcomes of conference attendance, particularly for academic conferences, but also for other types of conferences. It's really important to find out what's happening in your field, to find out what's the latest developments, and to learn what other people are working on, particularly in academic sector, because we generally are rewarded, however our universities reward us, for working with collaborators nationally and internationally. And that might be for grant submissions, it might be for projects, and it might be for joint publications. So not only is attending face-to-face so that you can meet people really important for individuals and delegates, it's also a really valuable selling point for conference organizers, because they know that that's the sort of thing that will attract people. Now, I can go on for a moment if you'd like me to, or if you want me to move on to move on to a different question, I can.
Thank you very much, Judith. That's talking a lot about the benefits of conferencing and the importance of networking that face-to-face meeting actually offers. I wonder if there would be any other research that shows the benefits of conferencing, and whether there are any conceptualizations or theorization available to think it further.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a good point. There is research out there by Hickson, amongst other people, that actually looked at what it is about the face-to-face that makes it different. One of the key things is that attendance at conferences can actually instill a motivation into people. So it actually can help them to feel a little bit more motivated. Perhaps you might remember yourself having been to a conference and feeling inspired about something, or feeling a sense of being a member of a greater whole, a community of interest of some kind. So that's one of the things that face-to-face attendance does. There's also some evidence to suggest that just talking over things, whether that's a topic of interest or an issue, can actually lead to new ways of thinking about how to solve a problem, and sometimes can actually lead to new insights. It's not entirely clear whether that's just a change of environment or surroundings that helps to facilitate that, or if there's something specific to conferencing. But we do know that often people who attend conferences do come back and then find that they've found new ways to solve issues at work, for example. And sometimes we have actually found that encounters and meetings at conferences have led to increased job satisfaction, partly perhaps because attending a conference is a nice thing to do, but also I think also because of that motivation and that enthusiasm that people can bring with them home from conferences, and it actually leads to improved performance. There is some research to suggest that it's not just the co-presence, so it's not just the fact that you're naturally sitting next to somebody or talking to them at the bar, whatever it has to say, but it's not just the fact that you're together in the same place, but actually it's because you're having meaningful conversations, and those meaningful conversations are what sort of spark your interest, your enthusiasm, and sometimes a bit of passion to rediscover a way you were working, or to find a new way to go about things. So there is a little bit of theory that can help us here. So the sociologist John Urry talks a lot about proximity and distance, and how they're part of our social life, and that people are always linked into patterns of obligation and patterns of commitment. And because of the technology that we now have at our disposal, these patterns of obligation, reciprocity, and commitment to other people are increasingly taking place over significant geographical distances. So it used to be something that perhaps you would feel with someone that you worked with, or someone that you knew quite well because they lived near you and you saw them often. Now, because of social media, we can still keep up with people, even if they're on the other side of the world. So the ideas of proximity and distance help us to understand a little bit about why conferences have such an impact on our social life. He also talks about the idea, John, or he also talks about the idea of co-presence. And again, it's not just that it's not just that you can develop a sense of connection with someone when you travel, but also that you are now at least able to maintain this connection, this sense of connection, and this sense of belonging, ideally to sustain it physically by travel. So co-presence is something that makes travel almost essential. But we are developing technology now that does allow us to keep up that sense of connection with other people more virtually. So that might actually be something that helps us in terms of understanding where to take conferencing in the future. That sense of connection or belonging that we want does not necessarily make travel essential anymore.
Thanks, Judith. I really like the idea of these obligations that are expanded now from one's regular workplace to the connections and the obligations that are created by working together with these new international people that we meet at conferences. And I also like the idea of this co-presence that are so important. And I wonder if this co-presence, whether it just stay in the intellectual exchange level, or it is something that is more embodied. And that reminded me of one of my colleagues who said that she's going to a conference because she really likes to dance there. So she actually provoked me to think about how to create then these opportunities that people really meet, and how could we recreate this co-presence in alternative conference spaces?
So there's a couple of things to think about there. There are alternatives to physically attending a conference, particularly now that we've got technology. So there's a lot of options that technology gives us, but I guess the question is whether that replicates the face-to-face conference or not. So in terms of technology, we can have virtual conferences with Zoom or Skype or other platforms. We could look at a hybrid model where perhaps some of the keynotes or some of the presentations are provided by a video link, or some might be pre-recorded, but some people are there in person to listen to it. Or we could have a fully online conference where it's not necessarily done by video, but nonetheless where papers are all submitted and you can read them, and it's open for discussions using instant messaging or chat functions, things like that. So there are quite a lot of ways we could have technology replacing the face-to-face conference. But as I said, it's not necessarily the case that the technology would always replicate the benefits of face-to-face conference. So if we have a look at the different types of attendance motivation, so why people want to go, we can have a look at which ones we can satisfy using technology and which ones might be a little bit more difficult and where we might need to rethink some of the alternatives. In terms of the professional development, that personal professional development and the educational component of a conference, all technology will allow us to do that. So virtual conferences or hybrid conferences will allow us to learn about new research, will allow us to hear important speakers present their work and present their ideas. And for most professional bodies, it would still fulfill the requirement of professional development activities, which is important for some professions like the medical profession and nursing and dentistry, where they actually have to attend conferences to make sure they maintain their professional accreditation. And there are some ways in which technology can facilitate a conference attendance by a number of different people by removing some of the barriers. So for example, an online or a virtual conference is almost certainly going to be much cheaper. So that addresses the cost issue. So not only is it cheaper in terms of the actual registration, but it cuts out the travel costs, cuts out the costs of accommodation while you're away from home, and your meals and your living costs. So in some ways, the online version of a conference would actually level the playing field for those delegates who might have less money to spend. That might be because they come from poorer countries, or it might be because they are early career researchers or other types of junior scholars who simply don't have as much money to spend on attending conferences. So in that way, an online event would actually be reducing some of the barriers to access. Additionally, online conferences can remove the time constraints that we might face in attending conferences if everything is made available whenever the delegate wants to engage. So obviously, if you're having a live element to the conference, that's going to happen whenever it has to happen, and so people will have to be present for that. But most of them will be recorded, meaning that delegates can actually engage with a keynote presentation or some panel session at a later date at a time that suits them. It's also much more convenient and saves a lot of time, again, in terms of the travel time. And finally, health and well-being, which is an important consideration when people are traveling, is usually related to the location of the conference. So whether somebody's concerned that the health facilities might not be as good as at home at a location overseas, for example, for a conference. So if a delegate's actually staying at home and attending the conference in their workplace or even in their own house, then that would actually remove most of the health and well-being concerns. But there are some elements that can't really be replaced as easily by the online or virtual experience. And the first one of these is the location. Now, we often know that people travel to conferences or choose conferences based on where they are taking place, particularly if they are taking place somewhere glamorous or exotic. So the location of a conference is a big draw card, and that might be just because people like the idea of visiting there, but also more likely because people do tend to attach some leisure or recreation time to their conference trips, adding on a long weekend or perhaps adding on a week's holiday, family holiday, if it's somewhere overseas. And so that can't be replaced by the online experience, although you can, of course, add in elements of the location of where the conference has been hosted from. It's not the same as actually visiting. And the final one that's hard to replicate is networking. And as I've said already, networking is a really important reason for attending. Now, it's not to say that you can't network online, but it is harder to replicate the informal nature of a conference online, because it's much harder to just stop someone in the queue in the coffee break and have an informal chat with them in the online space, compared to doing that, sort of in that face-to-face experience where you can just walk up to somebody that you don't know and just say hi. So it's not that it can't be done online, but it's certainly not as straightforward.
Thanks, Judith. When you were talking about obligations, the idea that came into my mind is, and during our virtual conference, lots of people expressed that it's very difficult to attend maybe a virtual conference because they have multiple obligations, and not to their workplace or the conference attendance, but rather to the things that happen simultaneously, such as looking after children, being with the family, or actually doing the actual work that they need to do. So when we go to a conference, that we create this intensive time and engagement when we are there full in person, and that's a little bit different, or actually a lot different when we are participating in online conferences. So that's one of the questions. And the other question that was raised through the virtual conference is that some companies and universities are not happy to pay for virtual conferences. And that's an interesting consideration when you were talking about professional development. So why face-to-face professional development is accepted as something that is worthwhile to go and pay for, and why virtual conferences is coming under a different category, so to say.
Thank you. Those are both really interesting questions. In relation to your first question about the difficulty of managing a virtual conference when you're at home and you've got other responsibilities, I actually find in my research and some other research that's been done, women especially tend to take all their responsibilities with them to a conference. So even if they're not physically present, they're still organising play dates, and they're still organising what goes on the shopping list, and they're still reminding everybody at home that somebody needs to take their gym kit. So actually, women have been multitasking in this way even when they're attending conferences face to face. So in some ways, it's not that different. Also, we do find, certainly in academic conferences, that a lot of people will take their work to an academic conference with them as well. So you'll often find people who have sat out of a session because they are catching up on their emails. Now, this is not ideal in terms of what the conference was designed for, but at the same time, that does seem to be what happens. So there is a clash, of course, of commitments when you are at home trying to manage attending an online conference with a myriad of other things that you're responsible for. But I'm not sure it's as big a clash as it might appear at first sight, because I think that a lot of that multitasking and that sort of mental load work has been done whether a woman is at home or attending conferences. Now, I can't quite say the same for men because I haven't researched them, but it may be something that's similar for them too. In relation to your second question around whether universities or employers consider face-to-face to be somehow better or different in terms of meeting professional requirements, there are differences, I think, depending on what kind of conference it is and depending on what discipline or background or profession you're in. So I know that in the university scenario, some areas, some disciplines like information technology and some of the engineering disciplines actually consider conferences to be more important than journal articles, because it takes a long time for a journal article to be published, whereas with a conference, attending a conference and presenting up-to-the-minute research is the best way to get what you're doing out there. So I think that there might be differences depending on the discipline you're in or depending on the profession you're in as to whether a virtual conference is considered to be the same. I would think that for areas where conferencing is important because of that necessity to get important information out there quickly, a virtual conference should be considered pretty much exactly the same as a face-to-face conference. For other areas, it might be less so, but there's definitely differences out there depending on what exactly your background is.
The COVID-19 epidemic, which unfolded since we have invited you to the Agora, provided us with some space for experimentation with online engagement. We had to transition the whole conference into online platform, and we learned a lot, of course, during this process. This necessity and opportunity highlighted some of the possibilities that there are with online engagement, but also showed us the limitations, such as, the limitation on technology, online access, software, and so on. And also showed us that it's very important to learn effective online communication. We also saw that the prolonged engagement, because we provided the conference between March 15 to the end of April, was very beneficial for many people. And because we produced this material also for later use, people saw the importance of this material as teaching resource. So what do you think are the other possibilities and issues with online engagement if you think about conferences?
Well, I think that one of the important things to think about is the networking, which is important, and how we might look at trying to replicate some of that. It does come with challenges, particularly some of the things you mentioned about software, bandwidth, lack of access to technology, etc. So all of those things I completely acknowledge. But in terms of what we might do to make things work a little bit better with online conferences, one of the ideas that's out there is what they call the hub and spoke model. So for large conferences with, let's say, hundreds of delegates, up thousands of delegates, rather than bringing everyone together in the one place, which is what's happened in the past, we could look at some kind of a hub and spoke model, meaning that there would be smaller groups that could meet together in convenient locations, and that could be 1 or 2 per country perhaps, or it could be where association chapters are based, so that people could stream in to watch keynotes, to watch panel sessions that were being either live streamed or presented on video. And that would still allow a certain amount of socializing. So there would be a smaller number of people at each of these spokes, these sub-conferences, if you want to call them that. So people could still do some networking, they could still get the benefits of some of the socializing that you would get with a regular conference, but rather than everybody traveling to the one place for a huge conference, it would simply be a bit smaller in each of the individual locations. There would also be quite significant benefits in terms of carbon emissions, because far fewer people would be traveling and they wouldn't be traveling so far. So that I think would also be beneficial for that kind of model. One of the problems that I highlighted earlier was the barriers to accessing conferences, particularly for people who are junior scholars or junior academics, or are simply more junior in their firm. It's much harder for people who have less access to money to travel to attend conferences. This means it's harder for them to form the networks in the first place. So we kind of know that we can maintain networks virtually. Social media allows us to do that, but so does emailing and Skyping and Zooming. So we can maintain networks virtually. The problem is forming those networks in the first place. So perhaps we might in the future think about giving preference to more junior staff members, early career researchers in the academic context, or more junior staff members to actually attend these conferences, to allow them to form their networks in the first place. And then they can maintain them virtually the same way as the rest of us maintain our networks virtually. So that would not remove conferencing face-to-face, but it would limit the requirement for lots and lots of people to travel, and perhaps reduce it down to a smaller group of people. I think it would also be useful to investigate the technology that's available to allow us to network online. There are some very basic things online. For example, in LinkedIn, you can send a message to anyone you like to and connect with anyone you want to, but there's also a facility on LinkedIn where if you are in a room with other people, you can connect with them much more easily by connections through Bluetooth. But perhaps we can sort out something like that for a virtual conference where you can virtually find out who else is logged in and set up connections using LinkedIn or another software. It doesn't quite allow you to bump into people in the way that you might do in the online environment, in the face-to-face environment. And that bumping into people does encourage informal chat. So that's something that we're still navigating. I think there was something in Second Life that allowed people to wander around a conference or a meeting virtually and walk up to people and send them a message. So it might be possible to do something like that in the virtual conference arena. I would imagine the technology exists, but I'm not sure that it's currently particularly widely used. But these, I think, are all possibilities for helping people to get that networking going, particularly where they don't already have their networks.
I think for me, what you are highlighting also is the importance of more established academics to help young scholars through these hurdles of creating their own networks. And I think that kind of remains the same issue, right? No matter whether it is participating in online or offline or, real face-to-face conferences. So thanks very much. I think that these solutions are really helpful to think through, and also the lots of benefits that you outlined also help us to actually take account of all the things that we need to be thinking about when we want to create or recreate the idea of conferencing for virtual engagements. Thank you very much for your time.